Between Camps. From Modernity and Infrahumanity. Nations, Encampments, and Fascism. As the example of Martinique makes clear, fascism's militarism and fraternalism changed the character of its national communities. However, the transformation of European nation-states into martial camps did not always coincide with the rise of fascism as a distinctive political and cultural technology. That process of consolidation and authoritarian reintegration should not be identified exclusively with the exceptional patterns exhibited where fascists triumphed. Colonial domination suggests that this process had a longer history and a more general significance. The nationalization, rationalization, and militarization of government communicated not only the entrance of race into the operations of modern political culture, but also the confluence of race and nation in the service of authoritarian ends. It should be apparent that modern nation-states have sometimes constituted camps in a straightforward descriptive sense. The organized work of disciplining and training citizens has had to coexist with less formal involutionary complexes, in which the fantastic idea of transmuting heterogeneity into homogeneity could be implemented and amplified outward as well as inward. Where race and nation become closely articulated, with each order of discourse conferring important legitimation on the other, the national principle can be recognized as having formed an important bond between different and even opposing nationalisms. The dominant varieties were bound to the subordinate by their shared notions of what nationality entailed. The forms of nationalism that invoke this mode of belonging exemplify camp thinking. They have distinctive rules and codes, and however bitterly their various practitioners may conflict with each other, a common approach to the problem of collective solidarity is betrayed by shared patterns of thought about self and other, friend and stranger, about culture and nature as binding agents, and about the technological institution of political collectivities to which one can be compelled to belong. The recurrence of unexpected connections between avowedly sworn foes defines one axis of race politics in the 20th century. What is more properly termed the anti-politics of race is deeply implicated in the institution of these national camps, and the emergence of nationalized statecraft as an alternative to the traditional conceptions of political activity. Politics is reconceptualized and reconstituted as a dualistic conflict between friends and enemies. At its worst, citizenship degenerates into soldiery, and the political imagination is entirely militarized. The exaltation of war and spontaneity, the cults of fraternity, youth, and violence, the explicitly anti-modern sacralization of the political sphere, and its colonization by civil religion involving uniforms, flags, and mass spectacles, all underline that these camps are fundamentally martial phenomena. They are armed and protected spaces that offer, at best, only a temporary break in unforgiving motion toward the next demanding phase of active conflict. Marx and Engels appropriated this idea of political solidarity in opposition to the power of nation-states, when, at the start of the Communist Manifesto, they described the world they saw progressively divided into two great hostile camps facing each other. The class-based identification of the countryless proletarians was thus also a matter of camp thinking, a mode of solidarity so powerful that it broke the historic allegiance of their universal class, industrial workers, to its respective national bourgeoisies. They saw antagonistic social forces more profound than those of the nation constituted in this distinctive arrangement. It would be foolish to deny that the internal organization of class consciousness and class struggle can also foster what Alexander Kluge and Oscar Negt, in their discussion of the history of the proletarian public sphere, call a camp mentality. They contrast the oppositional but nonetheless anti-democratic moods fostered in the sealed-off space of the class-based camp with the openness that a living public culture can accumulate even in the most beleaguered circumstances. although Kluge's and Negt's concern differ from mine in that they are directed toward histories of class and party as sources of camp thinking. It should be obvious that the solidarity of the camp can be constituted and fortified around dimensions of division other than class. The camp mentality is constituted by appeals to race, nation, and ethnic difference, by the lore of blood, bodies, and fantasies of absolute cultural identity, have several additional properties. They work through appeals to the value of national or ethnic purity. Their biopolitical potency immediately raises questions of prophylaxis and hygiene, as if the social body had to assure itself of its own identity by expelling waste matter. Claude Lefort, The Political Forms of Modern Society. They incite the regulation of fertility even more readily than they command the labor power of their affiliates. Where the nation is a kin group supposedly composed of uniform and interchangeable family groups, the bodies of women provide the favored testing grounds for the principles of obligation, deference, and duty that the camp/nation demands. The debates about immigration and nationality that continually surface in contemporary European politics have regularly presented the intrusions of blacks, Muslims, and other interlopers as an invasion. They can be used to illustrate each of these unsavory features. Though it may produce spectacular results, the camp mentality of the nationalists is betrayed by its crude theories of culture and might even be defined by the veneration of homogeneity, purity, and unanimity that it fosters. Inside the nation's fortifications, culture is required to assume an artificial texture and an impossibly even consistency. The national camp puts an end to any sense of cultural development. Culture as process is arrested. Petrified and sterile, it is impoverished by the national obligation not to change, but to recycle the past continually in an essentially unmodified mythic form. Tradition is reduced to simple repetition. In his unwholesome 19th century raciological inquiry into the meaning of nationality, Ernst Renan famously argued that there was an active contradiction between the demands of nation-building and those of authentic historical study. The nation and its new temporal order involved, for him, socialized forms of forgetting and historical error. These can be identified as further symptoms of the camp mentality. An orchestrated and enforced amnesia supplies the best climate in which the national camp's principles of belonging and solidarity become attractive and powerful. We will see that the national camp demands the negation of diaspora, not least because the latter places a premium on commemorative work. The diaspora opposes the camp, where it becomes comfortable in the in-between locations that camp thinking deprives of any significance. For the members of the ethnic, national, or racial camp, chronic conflict, a war in the background, latent as well as manifest hostility, can legitimize stern patterns of discipline, authority, and deference. The camp always operates under martial rules. Even if its ideologues speak the language of organic wholeness, it is stubbornly a place of seriality and mechanical solidarity. As it moves toward the totalitarian condition of permanent emergency, the camp is shaped by the terrifying sense that anything is possible. Deliberately adopting a position between camps of this sort is not a sign of indecision or equivocation. It is a timely choice. It can be a positive orientation against the patterns of authority, government, and conflict that characterize modernity's geometry of power. It can also promote a rich theoretical understanding of culture as a mutable and traveling phenomenon. Of course, occupying a space between camps means also that there is a danger of encountering hostility from both sides, of being caught in the pincers of camp thinking. Responding to this perilous predicament involves rethinking the practice of politics that is always debased where the nation-state operates under camp rules. We are immediately required to move outside the frustrating binary categories we have inherited, left and right, racist and anti-racist. We need analyses that are alive to the fluidity and contingency of a situation that seems to lack precedence. If we are to operate in these new circumstances, it helps to approach the problem of encampment from another angle, not as a means to comprehend the geopolitical interrelation of space, identity, and power with modern raciology, but as emblematic sociological and historical features of a volatile period. I have already identified these national camps as locations in which particular versions of solidarity, belonging, kinship, and identity have been devised, practiced, and policed. Now I want to turn away from the camp as a metaphor for the pathologies of race and nation, and move toward reflection upon actual camps and the political and cultural logics that produced them. These camps were and are a political technology, concrete institutions of radical evil, useless suffering, and modern misery, rather than odious, if somehow routine, expressions of the bad habits of power. To identify a connection between these very different kinds of camp, in effect between levels of racism and nationalism regarded as normal and the exceptional state represented by genocidal fascisms, may be dismissed as oversimple, even far-fetched. In recent British history, nationalism has sometimes been part of the best populist responses to the menacing neo-fascisms that have been exposed as alien and unpatriotic. Many writers, including Hannah Arendt, have also counterposed the stable juridical institutions of the nation-state to the anarchy and violence of the colonies, where raciology was first codified and institutionalized as a principle of government. However, I want to invoke a different case for the value of that linkage. This orientation is today supported by the bewildering tangles of recent post-colonial and post-imperial history. It is also a perspective that, as Aimé Césaire made clear long ago, went provocatively to the bottom of the relationship between civilization and barbarism. Its general message is certainly confirmed, for example, in the recent history of Rwanda, where, in conjunction with modern cultural technologies, the civilizing mission of colonial power hardened pre-colonial conflicts into full-fledged ethnic absolutism, fueled equally by the imperatives of raciology and francophony. There, too, the emergence of camp thinking, militaristic camp-style nationality, and encamped ethnicity, the key features of the first kind of camps, have been implicated in the institution of camps of the second variety. First, genocidal death spaces, in which victims were assembled, and then, bewilderingly, the refugee camps in which yesterday's killers became victims and reached out to seek aid and compassion. Understanding this situation entails more than just seeing camps as epiphanies of catastrophic modernity and focusing on the extensive colonial precedents for genocidal killing in Europe. It necessitates recognizing our own postmodern predicament. We are caught not only between national camps, but amid the uncertainties and anxieties that the condition of permanent emergency associated with the second type of camp both feeds on and creates. Drawing upon his own memories of suffering as he moved toward eloquent demands for justice, Primo Levi wisely recommended exactly this reorientation. He presents it most clearly as the conclusion of his reflections on the role of the collaborators and other victims of Nazi violence, whose persecutors made them complicit in their own destruction and the destruction of their kin and their communities. Facing these recurrent abominations, Levi suggests that this stance should now be part of what it means to adopt a healthy and alert, properly ethical attitude amid chronically corrupting circumstances. Quote, "The fever of our Western civilization that descends into hell with trumpets and drums, and its miserable adornments are the distorting image of our symbols of social prestige. We are so dazzled by power and prestige as to forget our essential fragility. Willingly or not, we come to terms with power, forgetting that we are all in the ghetto, that the ghetto is walled in, that outside the ghetto reign the lords of death, and that close by the train is waiting." Primo Levi, The Drowned and the Saved. Levi's argument should not be an open license to indulge in paranoia. It loses none of its force when we appreciate that the trains are not necessarily being loaded right now in our own neighborhoods. Fascism is not permanently on the brink of assuming terroristic governmental power. His point is far more subtle. If we wish to live a good life and enjoy just relations with our fellows, our conduct must be closely guided not just by this terrible history, but by the knowledge that these awful possibilities are always much closer than we like to imagine. To prevent their reappearance, we must dwell on them and with them, for they have become an essential moral resource, a compass sensitive to the demanding, individualizing, anti-ethical field of post-modernity. Levi's shocking insight is compounded by the fact that there are no more acceptable excuses for the failure to become completely familiar with the institutional life of camps. We do not have to become inmates to appreciate that their testimony calls out to us, and we must answer it. This means being alive to the camps out there now and the camps around the corner, the camps that are being prepared. From Identity, Belonging, and the Critique of Pure Sameness. When first he opens his eyes, an infant ought to see the fatherland, and up to the day of his death he ought never to see anything else. Every true Republican has drunk in love of country, that is to say, love of law and liberty, along with his mother's milk. This love is his whole existence. He sees nothing but the fatherland. He lives for it alone. When he is solitary, he is nothing. When he has ceased to have a fatherland, he no longer exists. And if he is not dead, he is worse than dead. Rousseau. If things aren't going too well in contemporary thought, it's because there's a return to abstractions, back to the problem of origins, all that sort of thing. Any analysis in terms of movements, vectors, is blocked. We're in a very weak phase, a period of reaction. Yet philosophy thought that it had done with the problem of origins. It was no longer a question of starting or finishing. The question was rather what happens in between. Gilles Deleuze. We have seen that the uncertain and divided world we inhabit has made racial identity matter in novel and powerful ways. But we should not take the concept of identity and its multiple associations with race and raciology for granted. The term identity has recently acquired great resonance both inside and outside the academic world. It offers far more than an obvious common-sense way of talking about individuality, community, and solidarity, and has provided a means to understand the interplay between subjective experiences of the world and the cultural and historical settings in which those fragile, meaningful subjectivities are formed. Identity has even been taken into the viscera of postmodern commerce, where the goal of planetary marketing promotes not just the targeting of objects and services to the identities of particular consumers, but the idea that any product whatsoever can be suffused with identity. Any commodity is open to being branded in ways that solicit identification and try to orchestrate identity. I want to show that there is more at stake in the current interest in identity than we often appreciate. I would also like to uncover some of the complexities that make identity a useful idea to explore, if we can only leave its obviousness behind, and recognize that it is far from being the simple issue that its currency in both government and marketplace makes it appear to be. Where the word becomes a concept, identity has been made central to a number of urgent theoretical and political issues, not least belonging, ethnicity, and nationality. Racialized conflicts, for example, are now understood by many commentators as a problem of the incompatible identities that mark out deeper conflicts between cultures and civilizations. This diagnosis sets up, or perhaps confirms, the even more widespread belief that the forms of political conflict with which racial division has been associated are somehow unreal or insubstantial, secondary or peripheral. This is something I intend to dispute. The new popularity of identity as an interpretive device is also a result of the exceptional plurality of meanings the term can harness. These diverse inflections, some of which are adapted from highly specialized academic usage, are condensed and interwoven as the term circulates. We are constantly informed that to share an identity is to be bonded on the most fundamental levels: national, racial, ethnic, regional, and local. Identity is always bounded and particular. It marks out the divisions and subsets in our social lives and helps to define the boundaries between our uneven, local attempts to make sense of the world. Nobody ever speaks of a human identity. The concept orients thinking away from any engagement with the basic anti-anthropological sameness that is the premise of this book. As Judith Butler puts in her thoughtful reflection on the concept, it seems that what we expect from the term identity will be cultural specificity, and that on occasion we even expect identity and specificity to work interchangeably. Judith Butler, Collected and Fractured. The same troubling qualities are evident where the term has been employed to articulate controversial and potentially illuminating themes in modern social and political theory. It has been a core component in the scholarly vocabulary designed to promote critical reflection upon who we are and what we want. Identity helps us to comprehend the formation of that perilous pronoun we, and to reckon with the patterns of inclusion and exclusion that it cannot help creating. This situation is made more difficult once identity is recognized as something of a problem in itself, and thereby acquires an additional weighting. Calculating the relationship between identity and difference, sameness and otherness, is an intrinsically political operation. It happens when political collectivities reflect on what makes their binding connections possible. It is a fundamental part of how they comprehend their kinship, which may be an imaginary connection, though nonetheless powerful for that. The distinctive language of identity appears again when people seek to calculate how tacit belonging to a group or community can be transformed into more active styles of solidarity, when they debate whether boundaries around a group should be constituted, and how, if at all, they should be enforced. Identity becomes a question of power and authority when a group seeks to realize itself in political form. This may be a nation, a state, a movement, a class, or some unsteady combination of them all. Writing about the need for political institutions and relationships at the dawn of our era, Rousseau drew attention to the bold and creative elements in the history of how disorganized and internally divided groups had been formed into coherent units capable of unified action and worthy of the special status that defined the nation as a political body. Reflecting on the achievements of heroic individual leaders as builders of political cultures that could attach citizens to the fatherland and to one another, he noted that the provision of a unifying common identity was a significant part of this political process. Significantly for our purposes, his example was taken from the history of the children of Israel. Quote, Moses conceived and executed the astonishing project of creating a nation out of a swarm of wretched fugitives, without arts, arms, talents, virtues, or courage, who were wandering as a horde of strangers over the face of the earth, without a single inch of ground to call their own. Out of this wandering and servile horde, Moses had the audacity to create a body politic, a free people. He gave them that durable set of institutions, proof against time, fortune, and conquerors, which 5,000 years have not been able to destroy or even alter. To prevent his people from melting away among foreign peoples, he gave them customs and usages incompatible with those of other nations. He overburdened them with peculiar rites and ceremonies. He inconvenienced them in 1,000 ways in order to keep them constantly on the alert and to make them forever strangers among other men. In outlining elements of the political technology that would eventually produce the nation as a fortified encampment, Rousseau drew attention to the old association between identity and territory. Moses' achievement is viewed as all the more impressive because it was accomplished without the binding power of shared land. Rousseau underlined that the varieties of connection to which our ideas of identity refer are historical, social, and cultural, rather than natural phenomena. Even at that early point in the constitution of modernity, he recognized that work must be done to summon the particularity and feelings of identity that are so often experienced as though they are spontaneous or automatic consequences of some governing culture or tradition that specifies basic and absolute differences between people. Consciousness of identity gains additional power from the idea that it is not the end product of one great man's audacity, but an outcome of shared and rooted experience, tied, in particular, to place, location, language, and mutuality. When we think about the tense relationship between sameness and difference analytically, the interplay of consciousness, territory, and place becomes a major theme. It affords insights into the core of conflicts over how democratic social and political life should be organized at the start of the 21st century. We should try to remember that the threshold between those two antagonistic conditions can be moved, and that identity-making has a history, even though its historical character is often systematically concealed. Focusing on identity helps us to ask in what sense the recognition of sameness and differentiation is a premise of the modern political culture that Rousseau affirmed, and which his writings still help us to analyze. The dizzying variety of ideas condensed into the concept of identity, and the wide range of issues to which it can be made to refer, foster analytical connections between themes and perspectives that are not conventionally associated. Links can be established between political, cultural, psychological, and psychoanalytic concerns. We need to consider, for example, how the emotional and affective bonds that form the specific basis of raciological and ethnic sameness are composed, and how they become patterned social activities with elaborate cultural features. How are they able to induce conspicuous acts of altruism, violence, and courage? How do they motivate people towards social interconnection in which individuality is renounced or dissolved into the larger whole represented by a nation, a people, a race, or an ethnic group? These questions are important because, as we have seen, grave moral and political consequences have followed once the magic of identity has been engaged tactically or in manipulative, deliberately oversimple ways. Even in the most civilized circumstances, the signs of sameness have degenerated readily into emblems of supposedly essential or immutable difference. The special appeal of individuality transcending sameness still provides an antidote to the forms of uncertainty and anxiety that have been associated with economic and political crises. The idea of fundamentally shared identity becomes a platform for the reverie of absolute and eternal division. The use of uniforms and other symbols to effect the sameness that identity only speaks about has sometimes been symptomatic of the process in which an anxious self can be shed and its concerns conjured away by the emergence of a stronger compound whole. The uniforms worn in the 1930s by fascists, and still worn by some fascist groups today, produced a compelling illusion of sameness, both for members of the group and for those who observed their spectacular activities. The British Union of Fascists, one of the less successful black-shirted organizations from that period, argued that their garb was all the more attractive to adherents when contrasted with the conflict and bitterness created by class-based divisions that were tearing the nation apart from within. The black shirt brings down one of the great barriers of class by removing differences of dress, and one of the objects of fascism is to break the barriers of class. Already, the black shirt has achieved, within our own ranks, that classless unity which we will ultimately secure within the nation as a whole. We will explore below how the ultranationalist and fascist movements of the 20th century deployed elaborate technological resources in order to generate spectacles of identity capable of unifying and coordinating inevitable, untidy diversity into an ideal and unnatural human uniformity. Their synthetic versions of fundamental identity looked most seductive where all difference had been banished or erased from the collective. Difference within was repressed in order to maximize the difference between these groups and others. Identity was celebrated extravagantly in military styles. Uniforms were combined with synchronized body movement, drill, pageantry, and visible hierarchy to create and feed the comforting belief in sameness as absolute metaphysical invariance. Men and women could then appear as interchangeable and disposable cogs in the encamped nation's military machine, or as indistinguishable cells in the larger organic entity that encompassed and dissolved their individuality. Their actions may even be imagined to express the inner spirit, fate, and historicality of the national community. The citizen was manifested as a soldier, and violence, potential as well as actual, was dedicated to the furtherance of national interests. That vital community was constituted in the dynamic interaction between marchers moving together in austere time and the crowds that watched and savored the spectacle they created. In disseminating these valuable political effects, identity was mediated by cultural and communicative technologies like film, lighting, and amplified sound. These 20th century attributes were only partly concealed by the invocation of ancient ritual and myth. The biblical stories of nation building that demonstrate divine favor and the moral sanctions it supplies to worldly political purposes have been invoked by many different nationalist groups. The Afrikaners of South Africa provide one especially interesting and unwholesome example of how Rousseau's peculiar rites and ceremonies need not always serve a benign purpose. Their ethnically minded ideologues systematically invented an Afrikaner identity during the period that saw the rise of fascist movements elsewhere. They provided their political community with its own version of Christianity and a repertory of myths that were the basis for the elaborate political drama that summoned their historic nation into racialized being. Quote, "The most dramatic event in the upsurge of Afrikaner nationalism was the symbolic Oxwagon Trek of 1938, which celebrated the victory of the Great Trek. 8 wagons named after Voortrekker heroes such as Piet Retief, Hendrik Potgieter, and Andries Pretorius traversed South Africa by different routes before they converged on a prominent hill overlooking Pretoria. There, on the 16th of December 1938, the centenary of the Battle of Blood River, which marked the defeat of the Zulu kingdom, more than 100,000 Afrikaners, perhaps 1/10 of the total Afrikaner people, attended the ceremonial laying of the foundation stone of the Voortrekker monument. Men grew beards, women wore Voortrekker dresses. For the occasion, they knelt in silent prayer. The ceremony concluded with the singing of Die Stem van Suid-Afrika, God Save the King, had been excluded. Today's ubiquitous conflicts between warring constituencies that claim incompatible and exclusive identities suggest that these large-scale theatrical techniques for producing and stabilizing identity and soliciting national, racial, or ethnic identification have been widely taken up. The reduction of identity to the uncomplicated, militarized, fraternal versions of pure sameness, pioneered by fascism and Nazism in the 1930s, is now routine, particularly where the forces of nationalism, tribalism, and ethnic division are at work. Identity is thus revealed as a critical element in the distinctive vocabulary used to voice the geopolitical dilemmas of the late modern age. Where the power of absolute identity is summoned up, it is often to account for situations in which the actions of individuals and groups are being reduced to little more than the functioning of some overarching pre-social mechanism. In the past, this machinery was often understood as a historical or economic process that defined the special, manifest destiny of the group in question. These days, it is more likely to be represented as a pre-political, socio-biological, or biocultural feature, something mysterious and genetic that sanctions especially harsh varieties of deterministic thinking. In this light, identity ceases to be an ongoing process of self-making and social interaction. It becomes instead a thing to be possessed and displayed. It is a silent sign that closes down the possibility of communication across the gulf between one heavily defended island of particularity and its equally well fortified neighbours, between one national encampment and others. When identity refers to an indelible mark or code somehow written into the bodies of its carriers, otherness can only be a threat. Identity is latent destiny. Seen or unseen, on the surface of the body or buried deep in its cells, identity forever sets one group apart from others who lack the particular chosen traits that become the basis of typology and comparative evaluation. No longer a site for the affirmation of subjectivity and autonomy, identity mutates. Its motion reveals a deep desire for mechanical solidarity, seriality, and hypersimilarity. The scope for individual agency dwindles and then disappears. People become bearers of the differences that the rhetoric of absolute identity invents and then invites them to celebrate. Rather than communicating and making choices, individuals are seen as obedient, silent passengers, moving across a flattened moral landscape toward the fixed destinies to which their essential identities, their genes, and the closed cultures they create have consigned them once and for all. And yet, the desire to fix identity in the body is inevitably frustrated by the body's refusal to disclose the required signs of absolute incompatibility people imagine to be located there. Numerous cross-cultural examples might be used to illustrate this point. Reports from the genocide in Rwanda repeatedly revealed that identity cards issued by the political authorities were a vital source of the information necessary to classify people into the supposedly natural tribal types that brought them either death or deliverance. There, as in several other well-documented instances of mass slaughter, the bodies in question did not freely disclose the secrets of identity. Quote, "Many Tutsis have been killed either because their ID cards marked them out as a Tutsi or because they did not have their card with them at the time and were therefore unable to prove that they were not a Tutsi. To escape the relentless discrimination they suffered, over the years many Tutsis bribed local government officials to get their ID card changed to Hutu. Unfortunately, this has not protected them. The Tutsi giveaways were 1. Being tall, and 2. Having a straight nose. Such criteria even led hysterical militias to kill a number of Hutus whose crime was being too tall for a Hutu. Where there was doubt about the person's physical characteristics or because of the complaints that too many Tutsis had changed their card, the Interahamwe called upon villagers to verify the Tutsi-ship of the quarry in question. From African Rights, Rwanda, Death, Despair, and Defiance. Similar events were still being reported 4 years later, when the genocidal assault against the Tutsis had been rearticulated into the civil war in Congo, a conflict that had already drawn in several other states and that appeared to provide the key to stability in the region. Under the presidency of Laurent Kabila, people whose physical characteristics made them suspect were still being openly murdered. It is important to remember, however, that the linguistic markers of residual colonial conflict between Anglophone and Francophone spheres of influence were also implicated in sustaining the killing. These fragments from a history of unspeakable barbarity underline how the notion of fixed identity operates easily on both sides of the chasm that usually divides scholarly writing from the disorderly world of political conflicts. Recently, identity has also come to constitute something of a bridge between the often discrepant approaches to understanding self and sociality found on the different sides of that widening gulf. As a theme in contemporary scholarship, identity has offered academic thinking an important route back toward the struggles and uncertainties of everyday life, where the idea of identity has become especially resonant. It has also provided the distinctive signatures of an inward, implosive turn that brings the difficult tasks of politics to an end by making them appear irrelevant in the face of deeper, more fundamental powers that regulate human conduct irrespective of governmental superficialities. If identity and difference are fundamental, then they are not amenable to being retooled by crude political methods that cannot possibly get to the heart of primal ontologies, destinies, and fates. When the stakes are this high, nothing can be done to offset the catastrophic consequences that result from tolerating difference and mistaken attempts at practicing democracy. Difference corrupts and compromises identity. Encounters with it are just as unwelcome and potentially destructive as they were for Houston Stewart Chamberlain. They place that most precious commodity, rooted identity, in grave jeopardy. When national and ethnic identities are represented and projected as pure, exposure to difference threatens them with dilution and compromises their prized purities with the ever-present possibility of contamination. Crossing as mixture and movement must be guarded against. New hatreds and violence arise not, as they did in the past, from supposedly reliable anthropological knowledge of the identity and difference of the other, but from the novel problem of not being able to locate the other's difference in the common-sense lexicon of alterity. Different people are certainly hated and feared, but the timely antipathy against them is nothing compared with the hatreds turned towards the greater menace of the half-different and the partially familiar. To have mixed is to have been party to a great betrayal. Any unsettling traces of hybridity must be excised from the tidy, bleached-out zones of impossibly pure culture. The safety of sameness can then be recovered by either of the two options that have regularly appeared at the meltdown point of this dismal logic: separation and slaughter. Identity, solidarity, and selfhood. The political language of identity levels out distinctions between chosen connections and given particularities, between the person you choose to be and the things that determine your individuality by being thrust upon you. It is particularly important for the argument that follows that the term identity has become a significant element in contemporary conflicts over cultural, ethnic, religious, racial, and national differences. The idea of collective identity has emerged as an object of political thinking, even if its appearance signals a sorry state of affairs in which the distinctive rules that define modern political culture are consciously set aside in favor of the pursuit of primordial feelings and mythic varieties of kinship that are mistakenly believed to be more profound. At the same time, individual identity, the counterpart to the collective, is constantly negotiated, cultivated, and protected as a source of pleasure, power, wealth, and potential danger. That identity is increasingly shaped in the marketplace, modified by the cultural industries, and managed and orchestrated in localized institutions and settings like schools, neighborhoods, and workplaces. It can be inscribed in the dull public world of official politics, where issues surrounding the absence of collective identity and the resulting disappearance of community and solidarity from social life have also been discussed at great length by politicians on different sides of the political divide. Other aspects of identity's foundational slipperiness can be detected in the way that the term is used to register the impact of processes that take place above and below the level at which the sovereign state and its distinctive modes of belonging are constituted. The growth of nationalisms and other absolutist religious and ethnic identities, the accentuation of regional and local divisions, and the changing relationship between supranational and subnational networks of economy, politics, and information have all endowed contemporary appeals to identity with extra significance. Identity has come to supply something of an anchor amid the turbulent waters of deindustrialization and the large-scale patterns of planetary reconstruction that are hesitantly named globalization. It would appear that recovering or possessing an appropriately grounded identity can provide a means to hold these historic but anxiety-inducing processes at bay. Taking pride or finding sanctuary in an exclusive identity affords a means to acquire certainty about who one is and where one fits, about the claims of community and the limits of social obligation. The politicization of gender and sexuality has enhanced the understanding of identity by directing attention to the social, familial, historical, and cultural factors that bear upon the formation and social reproduction of masculinity and femininity. Two groups of agents are bound together by the centripetal force of the stable gendered identities that they apparently hold in common. But the anxious, disciplinary intensity with which these ideas are entrenched seems to increase in inverse proportion to the collapse of family and household structures and the eclipse of male domestic domination. In these important areas, the concept of identity has nurtured new ways of thinking about the self, about sameness, and about solidarity. If abstract identity and its thematics are on the verge of becoming something of an obsessive preoccupation in the overdeveloped countries, this novel pattern communicates how political movements and governmental activities are being reconstituted by a change in the status and capacity of the nation-state.